Hi class, in this video we are starting our discussion of Chapter 5, Mass Communication, Propaganda, and Persuasion. And the first thing I want to do is define a couple of these things. First, persuasion. That is when communication from one person changes the opinions, attitude, or behavior of another. And you need to be able to distinguish between an opinion and an attitude. An opinion is what you think is true. It's primarily cognitive, it's your thoughts, and it's transient. It can be changed more easily than an attitude. An attitude is an opinion that includes an emotional or evaluative component. And because of that emotional part, those are much more difficult to change. As we get into this discussion, a big part of it is going to be media and how we consume that media, which is usually through our cell phones. So first, a little bit about this modern media landscape. First with cell phones. Cell phones can be so difficult to deal with because they are basically like slot machines. They offer this intermittent reward. You hear a sound and you're like, maybe someone's written me. I need to look to see if, someone has posted something interesting or commented on something I posted. You never know when there's going to be something there, and so you're always wanting to look. The problem with this is that cell phone addiction, which is highest in adolescence, is associated with some negative outcomes, specifically depression as well as lower school performance. And one reason for its connection with the lower school performance is related to a research experiment that was done by Thornton. And what they did was they had people come in and they had them perform either a hard task or an easy task, cognitive task. Half of the time, they were told that they should leave their cell phone on the table because they would need it for a survey about its features after they completed these cognitive tasks. Half the time, they put their cell phone away, it was not on the table. If their cell phone was on the table, even though they weren't touching it at that point of the experiment, they did 20% worse on the hard cognitive tasks. That just by having the cell phone there on the table. In another experiment that was done, a participant spoke with someone else. It was a Confederate, two strangers talking, where they took turns talking about interesting and meaningful events that had recently happened to them. Half of the time, a researcher left his cell phone on the table. Half of the time, there was just a notebook lying on the table. In the cell phone condition, people saw their partners as being less understanding, less trustworthy, and they thought that if they interacted with this person more, it wouldn't lead to a friendship. So it had this decreased social element just by having a cell phone present, even though no one was touching the cell phone while they were interacting. And this connects with social skills. So not just cell phone usage, but media consumption, whether it's or screen time, whether it's phones, TV, computers, video games, all of that stuff can affect your social skills. On average, Americans spend 10 hours a day on screens. It works out to about 5 hours with TV, 5 hours with phones. And Yules did an experiment looking at kids with this. Kids have slightly less media consumption. For the school kids in this group, it was about 4.5 hours a day, which is about average for school-aged children. For this, they had all of the school kids, they measured their social skills. And the way they did that was they had them look at pictures of faces and guess what the emotions were. The idea being that, can you tell how someone else is feeling? That's an important part of social interactions. After that, they divided the groups into 2 kids. Half of them were the control group. They just lived their life for the week. The other half of the kids went to a camp for 5 days, and they couldn't use their phones. So 5 days without phones. After that, all of the kids had their social skills tested again. The kids who had not used their phones for 5 days had significantly improved their social skills. So this increased use of screens has decreased our ability to interact with other people. In general, lots of social networking site usage is connected with people being more self-centered, being more narcissistic, being more likely to believe that fame, wealth, and popularity matter more than friendship, generosity, and community. But with this social media usage, one thing that matters is how you use it. For example, social media lurking, this is passive social media use. So this is just when you're scrolling through social media, you're not actually engaging or interacting with others. You're not writing comments, you're not liking things, whatever it is. People who use social media in that way, the lurking, tend to feel more depressed and more unhappy with their lives. They tend to see their lives as less exciting and to feel more left out of groups. So there are better ways and worse ways to engage with social media. But in general, the abundance of screen usage is not so great for us. One thing we get from screen usage, like watching TV, is persuasive messages. So let's move into persuasion when it comes to media. For this, if you think about what tends to be on the news, what stories are going to be the first one that are talked about in a news program, they are going to be the violent ones. The violence, the threats are what tend to lead media coverage because they're the things that tend to be the most compelling. The problem is that these repeated, vivid images shape our attitudes and our opinions. One way this happens is through media contagion, which is when media consumption leads to emotional contagion. Emotional contagion is when your emotional behavior triggers similar emotions and behaviors in observers. So media contagion is when you feel or do what you see in the media. One example of this is suicide. So in general, after a famous person dies by suicide, you tend to see an increase in suicide attempts in the community. So it's not just real, actual news coverage of a suicide. It can also be depictions. For example, the TV show 13 Reasons Why, which I don't know if it was on like a cable show or streaming. I was not the demographic for this show. But there was a depiction of suicide in 13 Reasons Why. And so Sheftfall did a research study looking at rates of suicide after that series came out. And what she found was that there was a 28.9% increase in suicides among the target demographic, so U.S. youths 10 to 17 years old, in the month after that show was released. And this was not just some random blip, because it was the highest rate of suicide among that demographic in the last 5 years. So seeing that on this popular show led to more youths attempting suicide themselves. Oh, wrong way. You also see the way media affects you with things like TV ads. So 90% of preschoolers have asked for a toy or a food that they saw advertised on TV. 2/3 of moms say that their young kids have sung an advertisement jingle that they've seen on TV. By 6th grade, 12% of kids believed that TV ads told the truth all or most of the time. But by 10th grade, that goes down to only 4%. Because now y'all are adults, you know they're always lying to you. But 12% of 6th graders think ads are telling the truth all or most of the time. But even as adults, you are not exempt from this susceptibility. For example, if you take aspirin as an example, or for example, like Aleve, if you see a commercial for Aleve, or you're going to the store because you want to buy a pain medicine, you're more likely to buy something that is name brand. Even though it is 100% identical to the generic, we tend to think those name brand products, the, Robitussin versus generic cough syrup, or Saran wrap versus generic film wrap, or Kleenex versus generic tissues. You think this product that you've seen advertised on TV is better. And so that's why those products get bought, even though they're more expensive. So even adults are susceptible to this. And connected with commercials, as well as what I'm going to get into, political ads, one reason why this is true is because unless there's something really horrible about the product or the person, whatever it is, the more you are exposed to something, the more you tend to like it. So if you see a lot of ads for something on TV, you are going to like that product. If you see, when it comes to politics, if you see a lot of ads about a person, you're more likely to like that candidate. Exposure works with political campaigns. So, for example, there is a positive correlation between advertising money spent and number of votes you get. So the people who spend the most get the most votes. As long as that's towards the beginning of the campaign, it's early in the campaign. So, for example, Michael Bloomberg tried to run for president in 2018, but he joined the campaign too late. So even though he threw in hundreds of millions of dollars, it wasn't early in the campaign. It did not lead to more votes. But if it is earlier, then you're helping to establish the narrative. It actually will get you more votes. You also have seen, there's some famous examples of political ads that have really sort of changed people's views. And again, it doesn't necessarily matter if it's true or not. It just matters how much people hear it. So one really famous example is the Willie Horton ad. And so what I'm going to do is show you that ad now.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
So this Willie Horton ad, this was George Bush, W's father, put this ad out in, what was Bush versus Dukakis was in 1988. And so Bush was the Republican, Dukakis was the Democrat. He was the governor in Massachusetts at the time. And so, there's this idea that Republicans are tough on crime and Democrats are easy on crime. And so Willie Horton was this man who was in prison in Massachusetts, and he got out on a weekend pass, and he raped a woman in Oxon Hill, Maryland, and stabbed her fiance. And Dukakis was the governor of Massachusetts at this time, but he had no say over weekend passes. It wasn't his program. He did not give Horton the weekend pass. But that is logic. That is facts. That's not emotion. That's not, here's this scary man, and there was an overt racial element. Here is this scary black man, and look at Dukakis, just let him out to go rape and stab a white couple. So it didn't matter what the facts are. It mattered the emotion that was brought into this. And so people were scared and angry. The facts weren't reassuring. And this ad was kind of the turning point for the campaign to start putting Bush in the lead over Dukakis, and Bush won that election. So having this ad played a whole bunch, it didn't matter what the facts were. This is what people started to believe. The most successful political candidates are the ones who tend to target strong emotions. Not always, but generally speaking. So what I'm going to do now, I'll show you one more famous ad, the Daisy ad, about nuclear weapons. So watch that one now.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So again, there's no facts presented in this ad, really. It's all about, you have to vote for me so your kids don't get blown up. Strong ads work. So question for you, can you think of an example of another political ad? Is there a political ad that sticks in your mind, a historical one or one from this last election cycle, that you think people were trying to get at your emotions with the ad? Okay. So next thing to go over is how this connects with education. What is the difference between education and propaganda? Education technically is the act of imparting wisdom or skill, whereas propaganda is the systematic propagation of a given doctrine. And so a couple of questions for you. One, are ads propaganda or education? Are political campaigns propaganda or education? What about school textbooks? What you learn in school, is that education or propaganda? For TV ads, that is propaganda. You are trying to get them to like your product. Who cares about the facts? Political campaigns, they might say they're educating the public, but there are definitely times when they are ignoring factual information. So it is definitely more of a combination. for textbooks, there's even debate in this. For example, in Texas, oh, bless them. A recent example, there was a debate. Some Texas educators sent in proposed curriculum that called slavery involuntary relocation. Using that phrase instead of explicitly talking about enslaved people is definitely more of a propaganda line than an education line. Or another example from Texas, that actually made it into a textbook that was taught in schools, the Atlantic slave trade. It said the Atlantic slave trade brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern U.S. to work on agricultural plantations. That is not how the majority of people would describe slavery, but that was what they were teaching in schools. So, do you teach about evolution in schools? What do you teach about evolution? When you are teaching sex ed, what do you teach for sex ed? What do you leave out? There are always people that are debating, is this propaganda or is this education, whatever form it tends to be in. There's all these little ways that you are either educating or it can technically be propaganda. I remember when my son was in kindergarten and they were doing a unit on families in the school. And so his homework, he had a handout that he brought home and he had to draw pictures for his family tree. But this family tree had mom, dad, siblings, grandparents. These were the, grandma, grandpa for the preset labels. And so, the teacher, the curriculum committee that created this handout, thought they were educating kids. This is what a family is. I wrote the teacher because I knew people in that school whose family did not consist of a mother and a father with a grandmother and a grandfather for each of those parents and siblings. And so I saw that as going over the line into propaganda because there's lots of ways families can look. If we're going to educate little kids about families, let's educate about all the ways families can look. So there's always going to be debate. What is propaganda? What is education? And one problem connected with this is that you have the filter bubble. The filter bubble is when we choose our preferred sources of information. We tend to only focus on the media sources or the social media sources that fit what we already think. And so we think it's education, but it's really propaganda for our own side. And so Pariser says that when we see mainly what others in our social network see and like, we're less likely to encounter stories that might challenge us, might broaden our opinions, or change our worldview. We're going to stay in our little bubble. One example of this that your book doesn't mention because it happened after your book was published, but I find interesting, was at the very beginning of COVID shutdowns. So March 2020. This survey was done by Pew Research Group, March 11th to 13th, so right at the beginning of everything shutting down. And they asked a few questions. They asked if the person was worried that someone in their family would catch COVID. And then they were asked if they thought the worst was yet to come. So would COVID get worse, or was the worst for our country already over? And again, this was in March 2020. And there was a significant difference in what people said based on whether they were Republican or Democrat. So when they were asked if they were worried, is someone in your family going to get COVID? For the Democrats, 68% were worried that someone in their family would get COVID. And I mean, at this point, almost everyone has. But for Republicans, let me change this to red. It was 40% who were worried that someone they knew would catch COVID. And when they were asked, is the worst yet to come or is the worst over? For Republicans, 40% thought the worst was yet to come. 60% thought the worst was already over in the US. For Democrats, 80% thought the worst was yet to come. Only 20% thought the worst was over. And so this is a filter bubble thing right here. If in March 2020, if you were Republican, you were watching Republican affiliated news. And that was downplaying COVID more. And so they didn't think someone they knew would catch COVID, and they thought the worst was already over. If you were a Democrat, you were watching more Democrat-leaning news, and they were talking about how horrible it was and everyone was going to catch it, and so it was actually going to get a lot worse. You also see differences with this connected to vaccines. Is the vaccine safe? Is it effective? You see this difference based on the sources you consume talking about the vaccine. And so you see significant differences in rates of vaccinated people based on who they voted for in the last election. The people who were voting for Trump were more likely to not think the vaccine was safe. The people who were voting for Biden more likely to think it's safe, because that's the type of media you are consuming connected with it. So your filter bubble affects what you tend to think. And that is where I'll stop for this video. In the next one, we'll start in on the 2 major routes for persuasion.